Um, in terms of Jack Goody, like what are some of the other more specific things that influence you about your studies with Jack Goody?
The only, let me see, the only specialized course I did with him, I think, was his West Africa course, which of course I didn't go there and I've never been there. But he also gave lectures on the sort of kinship patterns, pan-Eurasian kinship patterns, in which he placed a lot of emphasis on peasant structures, in which he later wrote up as a book. And it's very hard to say what specific influence I got out of this. It's the general approach that interested me, and showing up parallels between what have traditionally been thought of as very different societies, but convergences or connections over quite long distances, largely because, of course, peasants in the technical sense of the term have had to grapple with very similar factors, if you like, namely always under the thumb of traditional states and having to be simultaneously producing for themselves and often forcibly for others. And that does, Jack Goody, I think, showed that this tended to generate very similar kinds of structures and cultural orientations across very wide geographical areas, regardless of the huge linguistic and other differences involved.
And both of them, I mean, what's interesting to me about both of them is they were, to a certain extent, relativist, at least understanding how things could be fluid and influence each other, and there wasn't any absolutes in terms of the way we think about things or the way we see ourselves or whatever. But this is before social anthropology kind of went into postmodernism in a big way, somewhat
which
later.
I've sort of escaped, actually, by being here in Singapore, for the most part.
That's very nice, very good. But they were doing this in a kind of, I don't know, I'm myself playing with this idea of like empirical relativism or relativist empiricism or something like that, where you're grounded in some kind of empirical studies, but the outcome of these empirical studies is actually a relativist view. And so these guys, I think, were kind of ahead of the curve in that area.
As long as by relativist or relativism, we don't mean the extreme relativism that some American anthropologists established, which went so far as to say you can't even compare cultures because each
exactly.
It's not that sense. It's as I mentioned earlier, acknowledging that populations are very much involved in flows of ideas and so
behavior,
on.
You know? I mean, I think that's what characterizes you as you're a behaviorist, a behavior scientist, and going back even to your biology thing, where you're looking at physical behavior, physiological behavior. Now we're moving into, then moving into social and cultural behavior. But I mean, this is what I think is important is seeing it as behavior, and since it is behavior, it's not something you can nail to a table. It's language is the same as all part of that. So I mean, this is the kind of thing I've been pushing, is that this idea of now they even give ISO codes to languages. I mean, that's giving an ISO code to
they're going to have to revise them,
yeah, of course, because these things, are always going to be changing.
Some Aslianist colleagues of mine, ones working from Lund in Sweden, have recently published on a newly discovered language in Malaysia. I actually had recorded the ethnonym involved over 40 years ago, but I thought it was just they'd be speaking a language that was already known to exist, but they've shown it's a distinct language. It has no ISO code. It's going to have one now that it's been properly published with the grammatical sketch and so on. So that is a problem,
it's as if you give an ISO code to a particular style of dress or something like that. It's just behavior. So moving on from there, when you first went, I mean, you went to do your field work and everything? You said it was incredibly difficult. What drove you to do that? I mean, didn't you look at this and say, like, maybe I shouldn't go out in the middle of nowhere and have to be parachuted?
It must have been now I look back on it, it was kind of foolhardy. I'd never been a Boy Scout or anything
you
like
said you
it.
weren't even particularly fit at the time.
I became fit as a result of tramping through the forest. Yes, I can measure it actually. A journey that to the nearest urban settlement, which was very small and wasn't on the road, but it was on the railway, initially took me 3 days. It's about 18 miles. That's what I was told it was. Towards the end of my field work, I could do that in 1 day.
Wow.
So that's a measure of how fitter I had become. On the other hand, I think that running downhill, which I did a lot of, has eventually damaged my knees, both of which have in recent years been replaced surgically. So there's two sides to the story. When I got back from the field, back to the UK, I did feel the sitting in a room all day long trying to do some writing physically difficult. I wanted to get up and do things and be active, and for a while I just decided to do some yoga type exercises to keep my body active in this way. So that's one thing, the physical health aspect of it. I didn't suffer too much medically. I did once poison myself by eating some what turned out to be toadstools by thinking they were mushrooms. And I did get malaria towards the end of my fieldwork. It took some years to get rid of it. And it was a particularly nasty variety because I had 2 different infections at the same time, which meant fever every day. But eventually, I'm free of it now. I've been free of it for decades.
I thought it stays forever.
No, it can be got rid of. I was eventually treated in hospital in the UK with quinine because all the later drugs didn't work, and the malaria I got was in fact resistant to current drugs. As regards the physical isolation, that was difficult. There was a flying doctor that time, and the main village I was residing in did have a landing zone for the doctor to come in. I saw him once a month, and he was able to get letters in and out, which eventually ended up with Edmund Leach and with my family. Took about 2 months to get replies, and that correspondence is what part of that has gone into a chapter in my recent Tell Me Our Religion book. When things went wrong, like the tape recorder machine, which in those days was heavy and wood encased, there was an agent in Kuala Lumpur who could repair it, but I had to walk out, get on the train, take it to KL to get it repaired. That kind of thing doesn't really happen these days, and in fact that particular area now is crossed by roads, by interstate roads in Malaysia, and nowadays to get to the sort of area that I had to walk into long ago, nowadays Tell Me Our friends just meet me at the railway station and drive me in their own cars.
That's good. Yeah, the correspondence thing is interesting because that basically doesn't happen anymore. I mean, we use email or whatever, and so a lot of, in the past you would have collections like Sir Pierre Crover correspondence or some of the others, in your case with Professor Leach and whatever. That's a valuable source of information about the development of ideas and how things happen, but nowadays it's all just...
Leach gave the whole file back to me, which I have. It had previously been used only to help Tambaya when he wrote his book on Edmund Leach, and I gave him a lot of background information which he used in the book. But then when I was drafting my book on Tell Me Our Religion, I thought maybe I should have an appendix, but it eventually grew, and despite the advice of one of the outside readers, I decided to make it a full chapter, and it seems to have worked quite well.
Good. Yeah, that's for me. I find that sort of thing very interesting. The personal, but the personal correspondence. So it's a personal relationship, but at the same time, you're discussing ideas and the development of.
This actually has some historical interest because Leach was at the time discovering Lévi-Strauss, and in his own peculiar way, became the British Lévi-Straussian, but still different from Lévi-Strauss in some important ways. And my material, the sorts of things I was finding out about Temea, food taboos, and other kinds of behaviors, fitted directly into this sort of structuralist approach. And I did use a somewhat structuralist method of presentation in the original thesis without actually accepting the full structuralist theories, which I now certainly do not accept.
Right, yeah.
So that from the point of view of the history of anthropology, that bit in my book is of some interest.
Kind of late though, no? That he was just
No, it's about the time. We're talking about the 60s. So I had already, while I was back writing my thesis, I was by then reading Lévi-Strauss in the original French before it had been translated. And so that, I think, did help me shape some of the presentation. And there is a lot of material in Lévi-Strauss which I think is quite important, but I don't accept the theoretical framework that says cultures are structured.
Right.
There are structurings of cultures, but that is, from my view, somewhat of a political input. I call that regime, not culture. Right. I take a more Malinovskian view of culture more generally, that it's a bit of a mess. But
well, even a lot of structuralists like Hockett towards the end of his, like in say 67, he said that this idea of language being a neat system is a wild goose chase. It just doesn't work that way.
The state-of-the-art book.
Yeah.
Actually, as both linguist and as an anthropologist, I quite admire Hockett's work.
Yeah, he was very down to earth and solid. And so yeah, in the case of this structuralist kind of thing, there is structuration, you might say, I guess. But do you think there's little bits of culture and that come and go to a certain extent, rather than one big?
I think the structuration is largely what I would call political input, and that there are reasons why the powers that be in any particular society, and it doesn't have to be a hierarchical society, it could be even a highly egalitarian, segmentary, tribal type society. There are people who have an interest in maintaining the social organization to fit better with the chosen mode of subsistence, for example, like whether you want small local groups or large local groups, and so on and so forth. And they do tend to shape kinship structures, and recently I've been looking at grammatical structures to make certain ways of shaping the world more difficult to express than others. And by the time this happens, there's what I call a kind of cultural regime. But it's not absolute by any means. It's just that people who want to work outside this box, if you like, have to struggle more with language, have to behave in ways that perhaps other people would like to taboo and so on. But it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means it's a bit more difficult than going along with the what happens to be for the moment the established mainstream.
You sound like Thomas Kuhn.
I guess in a way, yeah, right.
No, really, because within the paradigm everything's fine, and if you try to, once you see the anomalies and you step outside the paradigm, it becomes difficult to even talk to the people inside the paradigm.
You can step outside.
Right. So
and in fact, people are always attempting to do so.
Yeah.
But they may not at first be understood when they try to do it.
Well, that's certainly the case in academia. If you're too far ahead of your time, somebody like Roy Harris or whatever, and it was too far ahead of his time, just can't be appreciated.
Right. Actually, Roy Harris was a bit of an influence on me.
Really?
I've never met him, but I read his books, and he still hasn't become a central figure in linguistics.
No, in fact, somebody wanted to make a fest strip for him, and it ended up being what they call a mouse strip, because there was nobody they could get to write. And so, in terms of your thinking about what you are doing, like what is the thing that drove you? Is it a personal thing that you want to understand, or a personal thing that you want to do? What did you drove you all these years?
I'm not sure I can give a simple answer to that, but I have. Unless someone has asked me to write a specific kind of thing, The topics I've chosen to work on, I have much preferred to work in areas on which very little is previously known. I like that sense of primary exploration, which in fact, as regards my original fieldwork, was some of it was indeed primary geographical exploration. I went into areas that very few outsiders had ever visited. But I like that sense of really fresh material on which very little already exists, if anything. So that applies whether it's linguistic or cultural or social organizational or whatever.
Is that just for the sake of, because it's like a fresh puzzle that you're
fresh puzzle, and also in terms of eventually publishing the material, I'm not sure what the point is of publishing yet another study on which there are already 1,000 studies. I think it makes more sense to contribute something which, who knows, maybe even 50 years from now people might find useful, because it dealt with stuff on which there was very little other material.
Oh, so it's making a very solid contribution to our understanding of the diversity of human behavior, which is important. And within those different aspects that you look at, is there one that is your favorite, you might say, or it's one that you identify most with?
This is perhaps a bit strange. I'm only about 1/3 of my time on linguistics, so I consider myself part-time linguist rather than amateur linguist. I actually think probably more highly of some of my linguistics papers than other things I've written, but these are the ones that are hardly ever cited, whereas the paper of mine that's most widely cited, hugely cited, is a paper I wrote many years ago on Singapore, which frankly I don't think is a particularly good paper, and I think I said some pretty obvious things that maybe they hadn't been said before. It's a paper on the cultural logic of Singapore's multiracialism. That's been cited many, many hundreds of times.
But people actually read it? Because a lot of times classics are cited more often.
No, I think
people haven't read it.
I think increasingly people may be getting at it second or third hand because it's been influential. But in terms of what I like about my work, that is not. I don't regard that as central at all. And my central work, I would say, is in comparative social organization, Temea and Aslian linguistics, and indeed I rather like my two papers on Malay, but again they're not. Perhaps because they were published in one was published in a collected volume on linguistic theory edited by Bill Foley. It didn't appear in a specifically Austronesian type context. The other was published in Southeast Asian Specialist Journal Bedrach, and published in Holland, which isn't specifically a linguistic journal. So those are papers I'm quite proud of, plus one or two of my more recent papers on Temea, which go beyond simply descriptive. They actually raise some theoretical issues. But I'm not primarily a linguist, so that's a bit strange in terms of my own output.
But still, it's interesting that you, well, I mean, I guess it's natural if you want to understand the culture, you need to understand the language. At least that was Boas's idea.
Right. The one Malaysian scholar who does very good work on the language without presenting it as linguistics is an anthropologist trained in Hawaii, and she does the transcriptions properly. The other American anthropologists on the whole have done good transcriptions when they report on the language.
What's important though, I mean, you know František Kartoffel, he is working in Alor, the island there, and he was asked by a team of people who were medical people working on the question of or the problem of malaria in Alor, because it's a hotspot for malaria, and the medical people first asked the anthropologists, but the anthropologists didn't know the languages, the local languages, and so they were interviewing the people in Malay, and they weren't getting answers that they thought made any sense, because the question was, why are these people not going to the hospital when they get malaria? Why are they not using the mosquito nets that they were given? Why are they, all of these kind of questions. So they brought in František, who speaks the local languages, and he found that when he interviewed them about these questions in Malay, and when he interviewed them in their own language, he got completely different answers.
Right.
It was very much a relativist type of thing, where they don't, in their own language, they don't see malaria as a single disease. It's 4 different types of fever that you get, and there are 4 different causes, and 2 of those causes are curses. So you wouldn't go to a hospital to get a curse off you or something like that.
Go to the shaman.
And you go to the shaman and find out what you did wrong, that somebody cursed you or something. So, I mean, this was a tremendous breakthrough in the understanding of these medical people, but it only happened through the language, the Abui, the language that they used in talking to the people about war.
In my own fieldwork, something similar happened. I've done briefer periods of ethnographic fieldwork on all the Orang Asli groups who surround the Temia. There's about half a dozen of them. And I used Temia, which is a kind of lingua franca, rather than Malay. And I think I got much better data that when we're talking to them. I've worked on other Orang Asli groups who don't know any Aslian languages, and I've had to use Malay, and I'm not sure whether the quality of the material I got would measure up to what I got when questioning in Temia.
Right. But in some of them, in terms of the quality of the grammars and things that linguists have done, you mentioned Nicole Crispy's grammar as being very good.
Very recently, that's to say in the last 10 years or so, there's been some superb work done on Aslian languages, superb by any standards of academic scholarly linguistics. Nicole Crispy on Samalai, Niklas Burenhult on Jahai. Earlier, Gerard Duflo had done a sketch grammar on Jahut, but these more recent studies are really big monographs, and there's more work coming out now. It's obvious that the Aslian languages contain features that don't fit particularly well with what's in the standard linguistics textbooks, and I think they will contribute quite a lot to broader linguistics in the end. At the beginning to do
so
some.
You mean things like the morphology?
Morphology, but also semantic structures, and this is something that Niklas Burenhult has been especially keen on showing.
Different from the usual aerial type things that we get?
Yes, partly because he has concentrated on languages spoken by people who, until recently, were actually nomadic hunter-gatherers, and some of them may still be, and he thinks that has a very strong influence on the whole semantic field.
Right, certainly, there's actually I edited a book in 2015 on non-linguistic influence myself and Rick de Bruce, non-linguistic influences on language, and of course that's a very obvious one. A student I've been corresponding with is now in the grasslands of northern Sichuan, working with Tibetans there, and she just said that they're nomads. What do you call herders, and they move around and herding these animals, and the vocabulary, she said, for all of these things is just fantastic, and it affects their way of thinking about all kinds of things. They're very different. So I'm, having her do a more immersion type, not using standard word lists or translations, but just trying to see how their structures, how their cognitive structures and whatnot are expressed in their everyday life, and trying to get a more empirical kind of approach rather than just translation type.
One other aspect of the Aslian languages that I think is quite important is they happen to be historically very conservative within the Mon Khmer branch of Austroasiatic. Perhaps I shouldn't say Mon Khmer branch, because nowadays we're supposed to say just Austroasiatic. But they retain, some of them, and Temia in particular, retain features which are reconstructible to Proto-Mon Khmer that a lot of the other languages in mainland Southeast Asia of that family have lost.
So what makes them reconstructible then?
Well, like vowel length contrasts in the Central Aslian languages, Temia and Samai, that has been reconstructed for Proto-Mon Khmer. They're very full of vowels. There are at least 9 places of articulation in most Aslian languages, vowel articulation, with also contrast of oral and nasal, and some of the languages long and short.
And register?
Register, no, except there seems to, one of the languages seems to have developed a creaky register secondarily, it's Mahmuri, but it doesn't seem to be there. But apparently that's not reconstructible to Proto-Mungkimer as far as I know. In all cases it's been reported it seems to be a secondary development. I think so, yeah. Just the same as, say, tone in Vietnamese, similarly.
Right.
Yeah.
But what do you think about the idea that there might be an eventual hookup with Austronesian in terms of, say, the Aslian morphology that supposedly was
Schmidt, a long time ago, suspected that this was the case and proposed Austric as consisting of Austroasiatic and Austronesian. Some other writers later, I think Schaffer was one who did this, but it's the 1920s. Paul Benedict for a while went along with this, but eventually decided there was insufficient common lexicon to support it. Gerard Difflot has tried to make the connection, but I think he says so far he's failed. I think Larry Reed still holds to this possibility and has published on it, but it seems to be pretty remote. I mean, it would make sense geographically. These are two adjacent families, and they presumably both originated somewhere in what is now the area between southeast China and say the mountainous parts of Burma across into Bangladesh, somewhere in that area, presumably. Would have been adjacent, but it doesn't seem to have worked so far in terms of rigorous historical reconstruction.
Well, it's just mainly the morphology, not so much the other things, but morphology is seen as important for establishing.
There are some shared features, some causative affixes seem to be shared.
Pa or something?
Pa, yeah. But others that, at least in Aslian, seem to be the same, I think are fairly clearly borrowings. It used to be thought that morphology was hard to borrow, but I don't think that.
Even affixes?
I don't agree with that. I think they are. They can be borrowed, yes, and have been.